government has apologised to me after a unit monitoring social media during the COVID pandemic branded me a known vaccine sceptic in a report they went on to share with a US counter-terrorism unit. The Cabinet Office has now admitted this report was inaccurate and not impartial. Joining me right now to discuss all of this is Silkie Carlo. She's director of the Civil Liberties campaign group Big Brother Watch, which discovered the report during a probe into the government's counter-disinformation activities during COVID. Thank you so much for joining us, Silkie. Simon Armstrong, of course, is also still with us. Here's my letter of apology from the Cabinet Office, which you helped me get. Great help from you. You've been monitoring all this stuff, and we published a report, and we discussed the report on the show previously about what the government was doing during this COVID period. Just to take us back, just briefly, can you tell us what units were there, and what was the ostensible visible purpose of these groups during the COVID pandemic years?
Well, as soon as the pandemic started, we saw these units pop up across government that claimed to be countering disinformation, but that had very broad, loosely worded remits, no accountability, no oversight, no legal powers. And it was clear that some of these units were also sending stuff to social media companies to be removed. So censorship units as well. We immediately
So they were monitoring stuff that was public. So like, I would post a tweet, as would many other people and politicians, a speech from Parliament. It would be, this was being monitored by these units, paid for by taxpayers' pounds, and then they would say, oh, we think that's disinformation, and then they flag it back to the government, and also to Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or whoever.
Yes, that's what we now know. But what they were saying was that, for the most part, they were interested in disinformation, which is purposeful.
Deliberate lying. It's lying.
Deliberate lying is the best way to put it.
But these units, originally, the aim of them was to tackle disinformation that was coming from foreign governments, wasn't it?
Precisely.
It was like Russia and China and Iran.
Yes, and that's why we thought that this deserved investigation. And I'm sure that disinformation is a real problem, and there probably was disinformation from some hostile foreign states. But what we found in the course of our investigation is that it was domestic dissidents, politically awkward people that were asking questions the government didn't want to be asked, such as yourself, and people that were campaigning for human rights, the rule of law, the proper functioning of parliaments. We've seen politicians across the spectrum, Caroline
democratically
Lucas,
elected
David Davis.
politicians.
Exactly.
Yeah, and scientists.
World-leading academics.
Yeah, like Carl Hennigan and others. Now, you did organised these subject access requests, very different, so much more in-depth than, say, just a freedom of information request, which can, as we know, can easily be sort of, palmed off. And we were able to get an awful lot of detail of, basically, what were you saying about me? What were you saying about other people? And I have to say, I was kind of blown away by the number of things they were monitoring. But they were monitoring things, and we discussed on the show before, even jokey tweets. Really jokey things about, like, I once posted the colour palette, the Dulex colour palette, for saying, this is breaking news, this is the latest government travel rules, because they went from green to red, and then there was amber, and then there was amber plus, and just a joke mocking the government, because we know in a democracy, again, mockery of stupid policies is also a fundamental right and serves a very strong purpose. But the tweets that they didn't like that I wrote was actually a report in the Telegraph about, basically the idea was that if children didn't get COVID jabs, by the way, no child who's healthy needed a COVID jab at all, always fought against that. We know even the JCVI was advising, first of all, said they didn't think children should get them. There was a suggestion that basically they shouldn't be allowed to go to school if they didn't get jabbed, to which I retweeted with, no, 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 no. That, they said, meant that I was a known vaccine sceptic, which of course I wasn't. I was vaccinated myself. I regret some of the things I've said about the vaccines. I certainly think they shouldn't have been offered to people under 50 or 60. But, we live and learn. But the key thing is we were able to debate that. But all this time, the government, while sending ministers onto my show, were secretly monitoring me and then smearing me and sending, this is one of the most sinister things, sending this document to a unit in the White House, a unit that was set up as a counter-terrorism unit to tackle disinformation from Russia and China.
Yeah, it's completely mind-blowing. And this particular case is particularly remarkable because the unit that claimed to be set up to counter disinformation, primarily foreign disinformation, was actually spreading misinformation about a British journalist across the corridors of power, across UK government, we found they sent 64 government email addresses and the US government. And this US government unit that they sent your tweets to was set up, as you say, as a counter-terror unit, and then purports now to work on foreign propaganda from Russia, Iran, China and North Korea, which you're not in any of those countries, Julia.
I don't think so.
You also hadn't spread any disinformation. I think the fact that your tweet just said no goes to show how low the tolerance was for opposition.
Yeah.
The counter-disinformation project lives on, unfortunately, and that's why we're still investigating and challenging
Well, that's it. Because people still say to me, oh, for goodness sake, let it go, woman. I always say never forgive, never forget. Because we just mentioning with Sam Armstrong, we are, who knows, we may be entering some very dangerous years ahead in terms of Middle East conflict, something spreading. Goodness knows what happens with Ukraine, what happens with China and Taiwan in the future. And it is very important that people are allowed to dissent from the official orthodoxy, allowed to criticise government policy, question it, ask for the facts. And if journalists, MPs, scientists and others are basically being smeared, are being questioned as if they are somehow enemies of the state, which is what it feels like I was being treated as, for doing our job, doing the job, frankly, that government ministers and civil servants should have been doing. And by the way, the rest of the media and the other MPs and other scientists should have been doing and did not and absolutely failed to do in those years, then we are in very sinister territory. So when people say, get over it, love, it's all over and done with, that's your concern, is this is now the norm.
Yeah, I mean, what we have today is an acknowledgement from the government that what they did in your case was unlawful, and their words were that it was inaccurate and not impartial. But this function within government is now a permanent function. It's overseen by Michelle Donnellan in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and we don't know what the counter-disinformation unit is doing now. And like you say, there are some really big topics where there needs to be open and free debate and dissent within the bounds of the law. So this is a crystal clear example. What needs to happen immediately is the counter-disinformation unit should be suspended. There should be a full investigation. We know that disinformation is a real problem, but we have to make sure that it's dealt with within the rule of law and in a way that doesn't mean you're spying on your own journalists and spreading lies about them to foreign governments.
That's the extraordinary thing, isn't it? Sam Armstrong's still with us, and I know you also work with the Free Speech Union and campaigning a lot on this during these years as well. This is the thing. This is very sinister. It's creeping. I'm sure that the ministers, the civil servants who set this up were like, oh, we're just trying to save people's lives. And we're always told it's all about saving lives, it's about keeping us safe. And that's always the argument. It's the same argument, though, that despotic tyrants use.
Yeah, and look, don't get me wrong. I think what you were doing, Julia, was very inconvenient. It was very annoying for the civil servants, the government ministers that were trying to push through that policy. But it was good for the system because what it meant is that their advice, their policies were getting tested. And where we have a real problem is that government officials are so prickly to scrutiny, even mild scrutiny, that they abuse powers given to them for very limited purposes, dealing with foreign governments, dealing with terrorism, to go after people that, as I say, no doubt you were inconvenient, but you were helpful. And what we risk losing is actually that internal checks and balances system that means that democratic countries like the UK are, in the long run, far more successful than despotic regimes around the world.
And this is the thing, isn't it? It's absolutely vital that governments do hear that. And we've had that with, the dissenting scientists who were just not being heard and were being smeared. And we know, someone who's in government right now, Neil O'Brien, he set up a website to smear me, other journalists, some of the most well-established, world-class scientists like Senator Gupta, like Carl Hennigan and others on a website. And he's now a government minister. I mean, I think, frankly, he should be ousted from polite society forever, as I have told him to his face. I think he's a despicable human being. I think, genuinely, I don't think you have any business being in government or being an MP if you're that anti-democratic. But the real worry here, isn't it? We saw after Elon Musk took over at Twitter, now X, he allowed independent journalists to come in and look at the internal documents. We saw how much the American government was trying to influence what social media companies were doing, ousting people, closing down their accounts, censoring conversation. And a lot of the time, they were censoring people who actually are now proven to have been in the right on the science.
Yes, two things to say on that. One is that something we found in the course of our investigation is that 60% of the speech that the counter-disinformation unit in the UK was flagging to Twitter didn't even breach Twitter rules, let alone the law. So the majority of the stuff that we've got civil servants working on is lawful speech. Bear in mind that the rules on Twitter at the time were that if something contradicted World Health Organization advice, that was against the rules. So we're talking about the lowest possible type of stuff. The other thing to say is that this is a problem across the West. The US unit that your tweets were sent to is a unit that came up in the Twitter files. What we're seeing, as Sam said, is a real abuse of power under the guise of countering disinformation.
Yeah. I mean, it really is very, very sinister indeed. That's the word that first came to mind when I saw this. Thank you so much for your hard work on this. You've done amazing work at Big Brother Watch, exposing all of this. And there are a lot of people who won't be aware of it or think, oh, what's the point of it now? This will be improving people's lives in the future, that we know about this stuff, we can counter this stuff. And it is so important that we protect these very, very delicate frameworks that our democracy rests on. And the Free Speech Union does that as well. So thank you, Silkie Carlo of Big Brother Watch, and also Sam Armstrong.